Well, good morning. I was thinking as Tim was praying there, truly, how blessed we are, aren't we, that God Himself was willing to die for the sins that we committed and has given us this privilege of coming together this morning as His children to speak with Him, to study His Word, to encourage one another. We need to remember these things each day. But, well, our class this morning, we finished Nehemiah last week, and we're beginning with the book of Esther this morning. Esther is the now the 17th book of the Old Testament, and it's now the last book in the history section in our study of the history of Israel. This is the last book now. Remember, we began our history study of Israel, remember, in Joshua, and that was a long time ago, roughly 1,000 years ago. In 1405 BC was when we began to look at Israel's history. You remember, Israel, with God and Joshua as commanders, were about to cross the Jordan into their promised land. And we've come a long way since then. And we've seen a lot. And here we are now in 486 BC in Persia. And again, we see God ruling in the affairs of His people. And we begin this morning with a question right away. Get our minds thinking. There's two features of this book, the book of Esther, that set it apart from nearly every other book of the Bible. Is there a feature that you could think of, Jeremy?
I think Dave's got it. It doesn't mention God
But,
in the entire book of Esther, as far as the name of God.
right,
It's not that God is absent, but it's the name of God.
right.
It's not in this book, which is unique.
That's right. Everyone hear Jeremy's point? We don't see the mention of God in this book. But as we'll see through the study of the lesson, we see His presence, but we just don't see His name, which is pretty unusual from everything we've studied so far, isn't it? There's another feature that you might have... Gord? Okay, yeah. That's well, we might have that with a few books we're not sure of. But that's a good point.
Where Judy came queen?
Think of the name of it.
Oh,
That's right.
it's a woman.
Yeah. Esther, there's only 2 books in the Bible that are named, bear the name of a woman. Ruth, the book of Ruth, and now the book of Esther. But something else a little interesting is our study of the post-exile nation. Now that Israel's been freed, it now moves from the activities in Jerusalem, and we're back into the land of Persia, where they were captive. And why that is kind of interesting. Israel's been freed from captivity, and they've been helped by Gentile kings that we've seen in reestablishing their homeland and their service to their God. Not that the kings changed their hearts, but they helped Israel to get back to their homeland, to serve their God. And yet we discover in Esther some who chose to continue to live in Persia. They didn't go back to Jerusalem. And we're also surprised, as Jeremy said, to find that nowhere is God mentioned in here. But to the trained eye, we're going to see Him in His providence, in how He has decided to look after His people. And then, of course, the fact that it's bearing the name of a woman. And as I studied through this lesson, I thought, the ladies, sometimes you might feel left out in God's in His service to God, because the men pray, the men teach. In the assembly, the women aren't. God has not given you that duty. But after studying Esther, you can plainly see that you are not left out of God's plan, of His service, of things that you can do. When we think of Esther, I've seen where you just need to be always looking. All of us have to be doing that. We need to look for ways that we can be of service to God. And we see here in the book of Esther that the women certainly are not left out of that duty. But anyways, Jeff?
It just that question made me think immediately. Actually, I thought of the similarity with the book of Acts and Esther. Not everybody may know, but the book of Acts is the only book in the New Testament that doesn't use the word love, which is unusual because there's the amount of sermons that are given in the book of Acts. But I see the similarity being that the book of Acts is actions. We see the love of God in the actions that God has done in the actions of His people. It's not something that needs to be said, it's something that we can see happening.
Right.
The same with Esther. We don't need to see the Word of God to know from all that we've learned from God that we're witnessing God's providence in action. We're seeing things in action.
Right.
So in that sense, I've seen a similarity between those two books.
Yes, that's a good point. I thought of that as soon as you mentioned love. Yeah, it's not mentioned, but
New Testament book.
right. But the attributes of it, we see it in the very beginning in Peter's sermon study on Wednesday nights. The book, see God's love, boom, right away, in that He desires for us to be saved. That's a good point, Jeff. Just to remind us that we need to look deeper into God's Word. And dig these blessings out. Jeremy?
And it also tells us a point. Sometimes we think God's not there. God is. We just have to look for Him, as you said. God is not always coming out and saying, well, this is my work. This is my doing. Sometimes He does. But sometimes we have to look. Perhaps this is God's doing. We may not see it while it's happening. But when we look back, Mordecai's going to say, who knows if you were put on the throne for this purpose.
Right.
Mordecai's not saying this is God's work as it's happening, but he's saying perhaps it is.
Right.
And so we need to look for God and not forget that He's there.
Right. He watches over the affairs. That's what we'll see, the affairs of man and the affairs of us too. And so as we begin Esther, of course, we always look at the origin of Esther, and the first thing we look at is the title, and might seem kind of a why ask this question, but why is the book called Esther, and what is the meaning of this name? What do you think of that question? I'm kind of not going to jump into all the answers at the beginning. Someone has some ideas. Thinking of our last two books that we studied, why do you think it's called Esther?
Maybe because the main character is Esther.
Exactly, Gord, right. Ezra.
Keep it simple there.
Yeah, well, that's what I thought, but it kind of helps us wake up. Ezra was the main character in Ezra. Nehemiah was his main character. And here, Esther. She's a young, orphaned Jewish woman who becomes queen of the Medo-Persian Empire. And the name Esther, is that a Hebrew name or is that a Persian name? Igor?
Well, she's Jewish, so I would assume Hebrew.
Or, yeah, it's maybe did I say Hebrew name or a Persian name? It's a Persian name, right. Esther's the Persian name meaning star, whereas her Hebrew name was Hadassah. I think that's how you pronounce it, Hadassah or Hadassah. And that meant myrtle. You know, we read that in Esther 2 and verse 7, actually. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter and then raised her. We'll look at that a little later on. I'm going to try and not double over in all our thought. Oh, Jeff?
I couldn't remember, does the book of Esther tell us the meaning of her name, Esther? Or is that just something we're taking for granted?
Yeah, well, I think I couldn't find it. I think that is secular meaning.
Possible, possibly not.
Yeah. Yeah. And some tie that in as a comparison with Jesus, the morning star. Maybe so, maybe not. It
I know
really.
sometimes, like many times, the Bible tells us the meaning of someone's name.
Yeah, but we don't get the Persian or the names of the other languages. You're right, but we can certainly see, sometimes the meanings of their names. We could see that kind of in their actions. So, and next, well, we look at the author and question 3. Whoops, sorry. Oh, what happened there?
Got a slide.
Oh, missed a slide. That's wild. Yes. Okay. Huh.
You
Hope
can tell us
that
anything.
doesn't continue to mess up. We'll see. Oh no. Okay. Yeah, I've left a slide out. Well, the question was, question 3 in your books. What may be known of the book's author from its content, and what evidence exists either in favor of or against Mordecai as its author? Josephus, the well-known first century Jewish historian, he considered Mordecai as the author, but evidence within the book seems to point against that. If you recall, in Ezra and Nehemiah, they were written in the first person. Remember we looked at that? They were written in the first person, crediting authorship to them. But here in Esther, Mordecai is always mentioned in the third person. If you look at chapter 2 and verse 5, in Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shemiah, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite. And all that we find in this book told of Mordecai and King Ahasuerus were recorded in the past tense. They've already happened. Or Mordecai, sorry. It's my early morning language. Mordecai. And King Ahasuerus were recorded in the past tense. But now the Babylonian Talmud, remember we looked at that commentary quite a bit in all our books, it suggests that the men of the great synagogue, the Jewish leaders, wrote Esther. But as we can see, if you looked and read all of Dave's thoughts there, it's almost impossible to say with assurance who wrote Esther. It's a pretty tough one. But we do know this, though, if we look at a few scriptures, that the author was Jewish, who wrote with a pro-Jewish attitude. If you look at chapter 4, I'll give a couple of passages here. I'll start with Jeremy. Chapter 4 and verse 16. And Naomi, I'll give you chapter 6 and verse 13. And Gord, I'll give you chapter 8 verses 16 and 17.
How about in Esther?
Yes. And we'll just see what we think of these verses. So chapter 4 and verse 16.
Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast you for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish.
Okay, and chapter 6 and verse 13.
And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. And his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him.
And Gord chapter 8 verses 16 and 17.
The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor, and in every province and in every city, wherever the king commanded and his elect reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday.
Okay, so we kind of see here a pro-Jewish attitude in all those verses. Someone that certainly spoke highly of them, thinks highly of them. And then in chapter 9, verses 26 to 32, we see here that whoever wrote this knew well Jewish customs. Verse 26, we begin, so they called these days Purim after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who would join them, that without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year, according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among their descendants. The author knew well of this custom. And the author was also a Persian Jew who was well acquainted with Persian customs and life in the time period that is recorded. If you look at chapter 1, verses 1 to 8, we see, let me just refresh my thought with that. That was all the beginning days of King Ahasuerus, and his feast, chapter 8 verses 8 and 9. Verses 8 and 9, what did we see? Oh yeah, we see there of the decree that was written, that we'll see that, talk about that later, Haman. And then in chapter 10, verses 1 to 2, we see here again the tribute that's applied on the land. It speaks again of Mordecai being second to King Ahasuerus. But I don't want to go into that too much because we're going to cover that a little later on. But as we said in the beginning, we're just not sure who wrote Esther. We can kind of see these thoughts that lead us to think, well, it was somebody that certainly was pro-Jewish. Maybe they were Jewish. It's hard to say. But as for the date now, our timeline begins, as always, with Israel at Mount Sinai receiving God's commandments. And remember, they received on that day His promises of guidance and protection. But roughly 860 years of disobedience, God allows Babylon to overtake Judah and destroy Jerusalem. And we always consider Israel in these times of devastation, but as I was doing this lesson, the thought jumped into my mind, what of God? I wonder how God felt. He looked after these people. He brought them out of Egypt. They rebelled against him for 860 years. He loves them. He's going to continue to reach out to them, as we see in this lesson. And he just watches them turn their backs upon them. It just made me think personally to myself of when I sin, when I fall short of what God has, all that he's offered me and done for me. It devastates him. But in his justice, as he spoke and has told Israel, and as we understand, we have to be punished. And we see that now with Israel. They've been taken into captivity. I thought of Jesus when I was thinking of that, weeping over Jerusalem. He knew they were going to nail him to the cross, and here he is weeping for them. Pretty amazing Savior that we have. And the events that we read of in Esther, what happened here? 14 to 7. Okay, I just take us through all that. After the Babylonian captivity, remember Zerubbabel returned first, then Ezra, and then Nehemiah. And now we're in the book of Esther, and these events take place during the reign of King Ahasuerus. Yeah, that's a tricky name, Ahasuerus, or Xerxes. I read a little later on, I think I mentioned it in the lesson, it seemed that the kings of Persia all carried that title of Ahasuerus. But his name was Xerxes. Now, I guess if we read a different secular book, we might find a different thought. But it's Ezra 1 and 1 makes specific mention of his 12th year in power. And in chapter 3 and 7, which would have put us about 473 BC. And then the book closes summarizing the remainder of his reign in chapter 10, verses 1 to 3. And therefore, we think that it must have been written after Ahasuerus' rule and death in about 464 BC. And helping with our dates, too, is the fact that the era of Greek power and prominence began in 303 BC. And in this book, though, we see no Greek influence in the language or thought or historical references of the book. Jeremy?
I said, when we can get confused at these kings. Ahasuerus came before the king that we read of in Ezra and Nehemiah, Artaxerxes. That's how we know that it's not during Ezra, because Artaxerxes is in Ezra, Artaxerxes is in Nehemiah. Ahasuerus is before, and if you go as far as I think there's another king in Ezra as well as Artaxerxes. There's a king before, so fitting them in history, this is the best place to put them.
Right.
To put this book, when you consider what the Persian kings and how long they reigned. We have a few Persian kings that we read of, Darius and Cyrus and Artaxerxes and Ahasuerus, and it can get confusing. But no, this king is Xerxes. I think Xerxes the first.
Yeah.
Depending on who.
I'm not sure where Darius was in there.
Darius would be further back.
Is he farther back?
He'd be Daniel. Daniel's around.
Oh, right.
Return,
Right. Yeah, we cover that when we look at the book of Daniel. We end up going before this time. But considering all this, then, we kind of conclude then that the book was written between the years 450 to 400 BC is kind of the timeline that we have come up with. And then we see here the Persian Empire at the time of Esther here. We study these empires, but at the height of the Persian Empire, after the conquest of Egypt, this empire encompassed approximately 3 million square miles, spanning 3 continents here. It spanned Iran, Turkey, parts of Central Asia, Pakistan, Thrace, Macedonia, and much of the Black Sea coastal regions. It included Afghanistan, Iraq, northern Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and all pretty much significant population centers of ancient Egypt as far west as Libya. And it's noted in Western history that the Persians were an agonistic foe of the Greek city-states during the Greco-Persian Wars, as they fought for the emancipation of the Jewish slaves. But they weren't a backwards nation by no means. They instituted infrastructures such as a postal system road that ran the complete distance of this, so decrees and laws could be passed quickly across this nation, across this empire. They built road systems, and they also had the usage of an official language throughout its territory. The language was to be spoken, everyone was to speak the same language. There was no confusion. And the empire had a centralized bureaucratic administration under the emperor, and a large professional army, and civil services they had. And they inspired similar developments in later empires. We think of the impression that the Greek Empire has on the world even to this day. But at that time, Persia impressed a lot of the empires that were to come. So it was quite... Jeremy?
They had one unique thing that we don't read of empires before it, or really empires after it happening. We'll see it in Esther, we'll see it in Daniel too.
Right.
They had this weird rule that if they passed a law, couldn't be taken back.
Right.
We're going to find it in Esther, just as we find it in Daniel. And that's a unique thing of this Persian Empire, is that if Canada, the United States, or Europe did that today, we could have some pretty bad laws.
Yep.
That if they couldn't be repealed. We'll find there, in Daniel, it doesn't seem that the emperor decided to try to get around it. Ahasuerus here is gonna employ a unique way of getting around that rule, but I'll save that for later.
Right. It also showed, well, I guess we could say that till later, but show what an impulsive leader he was. We'll see that in some of his attitude. But we move now into the purpose of Esther. Missing that one slide has thrown me here every time I click now. I wonder what we're going to get. The historical purpose of Esther. And we're asked the question, what historical background having to do with the Israelites does Esther provide that is not found elsewhere in the Old Testament? Dave's given us a few of these thoughts in some of our books. What is found in one book and not found in another book. But there's something found in the book of Esther concerning Israel that we don't find anywhere else. Jeremy?
Why they celebrate the Feast of Purim.
Right.
It's not an Old Testament. I'll make a point.
Yeah.
It's not a law of Moses feast. It's a feast that secular Israel has set up, just like we have Canada Day and Victoria Day and all of these other holidays. This is a secular feast, remembering an historical event, but it's not a feast that God commanded that they remember, but it's what the Jews commanded themselves to remember. So
Right.
it's not a religious holiday in one sense, but it does have a historical background.
Right. And at that time,
And it exists today too.
that's true, yeah, they still remember it. But Jeremy's right, we look at that a little later on, that it wasn't in the law of Moses. It wasn't a command from God. But at that time, certainly, I believe it would have been good for them to remember that. And it just, we mentioned this a little later on, but maybe it's such a shame that they don't really see the full picture, of what God did for them. But as Jeremy, Jeff?
No. It gives us a good lesson. It's not wrong to have a tradition.
No.
We don't ever want to get to that point where we're over tradition. As long as traditions don't take away from or add to God's word, this is exactly what Jesus accused the Pharisees, that their traditions causing them to ignore, break, or reject the commandments of God.
Right. Right. It's like we gather together as Christ's church every Sunday to remember his memorial, what he's done for us. There's certainly nothing wrong for you to take time out of the day and sit down and remember. Remind yourself what Christ has done for you. You're not partaking of the feast, but there is nothing wrong. And like Jeff says, as long as we're not stepping outside of the boundaries and the direction that God's given us, then that's your own personal preference. And as Jeremy said, they still remember it today, but the shame of it all is if they would see the big picture,
And to go along with Jeff's point, this was not a religious holiday.
No.
We can't, some people try to say, well, especially when it comes to Easter and Christmas, well, it's not, like as far as it doesn't break anything in the Bible, as far as remember, having Easter and Christmas doesn't take away anything from the Bible, and we're not, but no, this wasn't a religious holiday. This was a secular holiday, remembering something.
Right.
We can have secular holidays. We can make some choices that don't break God's word and are good to make. There's nothing wrong with celebrating a holiday per se, but this wasn't an addition to the law of Moses. And if it was an addition to the law of Moses, God would have had something to say about it, because it wasn't his addition to the law of Moses.
Right.
This was a secular thing, and we can like as far as Victoria Day is coming up in a month. It's a holiday. It's not a religious holiday. It's remembering Queen's birthday, and most people it's a day off.
Right.
But
Which we're thankful for.
Which we're thankful for. But it shows that there's nothing wrong with holidays per se, as long as we don't elevate them to religion, if they're not religion, and they don't break God's law.
Right. And so as we said then, this feast is to remember how the Jews that were living at this time throughout the whole Medo-Persian Empire were spared from extinction, okay, through the efforts of a young Jewish woman and her cousin Mordecai, who lived in the Persian capital. We read that in Esther 2, 5, and 7. And King Ahasuerus granted them, Jeremy's already shed some light on it, but we will look into it deeper later on. But King Ahasuerus grants them the right to defend themselves against the law that he granted to the murderous Haman. But we'll look at that a little later on. And that is not mentioned elsewhere in the Old Testament.
Not mentioned in the New Testament either.
Yeah, and it's not mentioned in the New Testament neither. Not that they probably didn't read.
No, but I'm saying we don't read in the Gospels Jesus keeping this feast.
No.
We read of some other feasts, but we don't read of it. But it would still be, it's around today, so it was around then too.
Right, but that's a good point. Remember that Jesus nowhere remembers that. We don't read of that. So we're asked the question, now, in what ways is Esther different from the other historical books? We're speaking really of Ezra and Nehemiah, which covered this particular period of Israel's history. And I already kind of mentioned this thought, but what's different here? The story in Esther differs from our stories of Ezra and Nehemiah. What do you think? What difference did you see? Where?
Setting?
Yes, Jeff. Yeah. The setting. Up until now, Ezra and Nehemiah, we followed Israel as she made her way back to her homeland after 70 years in captivity. And included in this journey were the outstanding efforts of those who trusted Jehovah with all their hearts. We think of Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah. And within this period, though, our attention is taken to the only biblical portrait of the many Jews who chose to remain in Persia rather than to return to Palestine. And we could discuss all morning about why these Jews stayed and should they have stayed. I believe, though, Scripture would have us more focus on God's providence in this book and His protection and His guiding hand. I think Dave, Jeremy?
Even though, as you're right, you can discuss why they stayed, but God didn't abandon them because they stayed.
Right. That's right. And I think Dave might have made mention of in the book of Acts where the Jews came from elsewhere back to Jerusalem to remember Pentecost. So there was. Okay, that's a little quieter.
You told me to quiet.
Yeah, right. Matthew Henry made the comment in his commentary. I thought, also speaking of God not being mentioned, if the name of God is not here in this book, he says that his finger certainly is. So that was just kind of an interesting thought. Well, the buzzer's gone. I think our next question, our next question, certainly we will not do that in 2 minutes. So we'll leave that and we'll pick up next week. We will begin with the doctrinal purpose of the book of Esther. So we'll leave that for now then, and we'll end our class.